President Trump now doubling his punch on steel and aluminum tariffs.
We're going to bring it from 25% to 50%, the tariffs on steel into the United States of America.
Currently, U.S. manufacturers import about a quarter of their steel from overseas. With this new tariff threat, they would pay more for production costs to build cars, home appliances, furniture, and tools. Already, the price of steel in the U.S. is substantially higher than in other major manufacturing nations.
What if the single biggest move designed to make America stronger ended up making it weaker? Imagine a policy so bold, it promised to revive forgotten factories and put a nation first. Now, imagine that same policy triggering a chain reaction so severe it would wipe out hundreds of thousands of jobs, inflame global tensions, and force ordinary families to stand in line for food. This isn't a dystopian fiction. This was the reality of June 2025, when a historic economic decision was made. A decision that would unravel in ways its creators never saw coming.
Every decision on trade, on taxes, on immigration, on foreign affairs will be made to benefit American workers and American families.
The promise was a resounding victory, but the reality? A devastating backfire that's still being felt today. Stick with us, because the story of how a 50% tariff attempt spectacularly failed is a lesson every single person needs to hear. Before we dive into these shocking details, make sure you're subscribed with notifications on. This is one analysis you do not want to miss. And be sure to let us know in the comments. Do you think economic protectionism works, or does it always lead to self-sabotage? The rhetoric was about protecting the heartland, but the reality felt like a targeted strike on the very people it promised to save. Almost overnight, the America First tariff morphed into a brutal hidden tax on everyday Americans. In states like Ohio and Kentucky, the silence was deafening. Factories that had once hummed with the sound of industry fell silent, as the cost of raw steel and aluminum skyrocketed by as much as 50%. This wasn't just a number on a spreadsheet. It was a death sentence for downstream manufacturers who simply couldn't absorb the cost. The math was brutal and inescapable, but the real story was human. Picture a welder in Pittsburgh, a man who built his life on a steady paycheck and the pride of his craft, now waiting in an unemployment line, watching his family's stability shatter. Or a single mother in Ohio, her job at an auto parts plant gone, desperately piecing together part-time gigs while her kids worry about their next meal. This is where the policy landed, not in boardrooms, but in living rooms. It eroded community cohesion, sent reliance on food banks soaring, and stretched mental health services in Rust Belt towns to their absolute breaking point. And for what? The construction of new bridges and buildings ground to a halt as budgets were obliterated by tariff-induced premiums, while the price of everything from a new car to a simple can of vegetables crept higher and higher, squeezing household budgets for an extra $2,400 a year. The first domino had fallen, and it was crushing the American dream it was supposed to protect. But the shockwaves were just beginning to travel, and where they went next would redefine global alliances forever. But the United States wasn't operating in a vacuum, and the assumption that its trading partners would simply absorb this economic blow without a response. That was perhaps the most catastrophic miscalculation. The world didn't back down. It fought back with stunning speed and precision. Allies became adversaries overnight. Canada, the nation's closest trading partner, viewed the tariffs not as a policy, but as a direct threat to its own economic stability. Refusing to be passively beaten, Ottawa launched a cautious yet firm retaliation, imposing mirror tariffs of up to 50% on iconic American exports, whiskey, motorcycles, and agricultural products. This wasn't an act of aggression, it was one of pure necessity. And while leaders like Prime Minister Trudeau emphasized dialogue, their actions spoke louder than words. They immediately began diversifying trade partnerships with the EU and Asia, actively building bridges away from the instability emanating from the South. Meanwhile, competitors like China saw a golden opportunity. They escalated tensions to a fever pitch, slapping tariffs as high as 125% on U.S. goods, while aggressively seeking alternative markets for American soybeans and other agricultural products, deliberately aiming their retaliation at the heart of Trump's political base. But the most ironic twist? Quebec's aluminum industry, powered by cheap hydroelectricity, didn't just survive, it thrived. By early 2025, they had boosted production by 12%, actively attracting orders from international markets that were now wary of U.S. unpredictability. So, a policy meant to weaken foreign competition instead strengthened it, handing a massive advantage to a key ally-turned-rival. The message from the globe was clear: adapt or be left behind. And this global realignment set the stage for a terrifying domino effect that would soon cripple the very backbone of the U.S. economy itself. If the initial job losses were the first crack, what followed was the complete shattering of entire industries. The tariffs didn't just make materials more expensive, they systematically dismantled the competitive edge of the world's largest economy from the inside out. The numbers are so stark, they're almost hard to believe. In the first half of 2025 alone, over 100,000 manufacturing jobs vanished into thin air. But behind that number are names and faces. Automotive giants like Ford and General Motors saw their costs surge by up to $2,000 per vehicle. The result? Massive layoffs at assembly lines in Michigan and price hikes that pushed consumers already strained by inflation completely out of the market. Then came the agriculture sector, the heartland's lifeblood. John Deere, an iconic American company, announced mass layoffs at its Midwestern plants, publicly attributing $300 million in losses directly to the tariffs. Farmers, already reeling from China's retaliatory duties on soybeans and pork, now faced a second, brutal blow. The cost of the very equipment they needed to survive, tractors, combines, harvesters, ballooned by 20%. This wasn't just about profit margins, it was a direct threat to national food security, making harvests less efficient and more expensive. Even the aerospace and defense sector, reliant on lightweight aluminum, wasn't immune. Production delays plagued Boeing facilities, compromising critical national defense contracts and eroding U.S. competitiveness in the global market. And perhaps most dangerously, the infrastructure all Americans depend on began to crumble. Public works projects from bridges in Cleveland to new construction projects simply ground to a halt. The aluminum and steel needed for reinforcements became prohibitively expensive, pushing city and state budgets over the edge and leading to deferred maintenance that heightened the risk of actual structural failures. The policy's expansion in August 2025 to over 407 derivative products, things like fire extinguishers, machinery, and chemicals, was the final twist of the knife, ensnaring small businesses and suppliers who couldn't absorb a 50% premium on their inputs, leading to a wave of bankruptcies. Every sector, every supply chain, every single link that held the economy together was feeling the strain. But just as the situation seemed hopeless, a controversial glimmer of hope emerged from the most unlikely place, and it would force everyone to question everything they thought they knew about this so-called victory. Amidst the overwhelming carnage, defenders of the policy pointed to a few fragile silver linings. And it's true, if you looked in one very specific direction, you could almost squint and see a victory. Domestic steel production did see modest gains. The revenues collected from the tariffs themselves reached a staggering $172 billion. On paper, that sounds like a win, a potential fund for infrastructure or tax relief. But this is where the story gets really dark. Because when you hold that so-called victory up to the light, it reveals itself to be a devastating illusion, a trick of the numbers that hides a brutal truth. The cost of achieving those minor gains was astronomically, almost unimaginably, high. The most damning statistic to emerge from the entire crisis was this: for every single job saved or created in the metals industry, an estimated 75 jobs were lost elsewhere in the economy. Let that sink in. A policy that promised to be a net creator of employment became a massive net destroyer of it. The $172 billion in tariff revenue? It was effectively a tax paid by American consumers and businesses on more expensive goods. That money wasn't new wealth generated. It was wealth being moved and ultimately destroyed, creating a massive drag on GDP growth, which was shaved by 0.5 percentage point. The promised revival of manufacturing didn't materialize. Instead, it accelerated the very decline it sought to reverse. So, we're left with a haunting moral and economic question. Can you even call it a victory if the price you pay is so much higher than the prize you win? If you burn down a village to save a single house, have you really saved anything at all? This internal contradiction set the stage for the most profound and lasting impact of all, one that would quietly reshape the global order and leave America's standing in the world permanently altered. The most enduring damage from the tariff war couldn't be measured just in lost jobs or higher prices. It was measured in a seismic shift in global influence. While the U.S. was looking inward, the rest of the world was moving on, and the balance of power quietly tilted away. Former allies like Canada and nations within the European Union, once reliant on American markets, didn't just get angry, they got strategic. They accelerated their efforts to diversify trade away from the United States, signing new partnerships that deliberately excluded it. Meanwhile, competitors, namely China, seized the opportunity with both hands. They actively strengthened their position in the international arena, presenting themselves as a more stable and predictable trading partner and mopping up agricultural markets that American farmers were suddenly locked out of. The result? A stunning weakening of U.S. influence in global trade. The policy designed to assert American dominance ultimately had the opposite effect, fostering a new global reality where nations decided they could no longer afford to depend on the U.S. This is the ultimate lesson written in the economic rubble of 2025. In a world interconnected by complex supply chains and shared prosperity, no nation, not even a superpower, can isolate itself without paying a devastating price. The pursuit of protectionism doesn't safeguard people. It sows the seeds of global discord that ultimately harvests suffering at home. The story of the 50% tariff isn't just an economic case study. It's a cautionary tale about the irreversible cost of going it alone. It's a lesson written in closed factories, shuttered businesses, and the quiet realignment of a world that learned to adapt, leaving the architect of its own isolation to face the consequences. So, what's the final verdict? Did this policy protect America, or did it ultimately leave it more vulnerable than before? The data speaks for itself, but we want to hear from you. Let us know in the comments. Do you believe economic protectionism can ever work, or is it always a recipe for disaster? This is one of those stories that proves reality is often stranger and more shocking than fiction. If this deep dive surprised you, or if you know someone who needs to see the real-world cost of these decisions, share this video. We put a tremendous amount of research into analyses like this to give you the full, unfiltered story. If you want to make sure you don't miss our next investigation, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and tap the bell icon so you're always the first to know when we drop a new video. Thanks for watching. Stay curious,